Hey, you guys, Brother John checking in for Wednesday in the Word, but on Thursday. And so had some logistical reasons we weren't able to do that yesterday. And obviously, we're back in the Enoch kitchen, as you can see behind me, as we've shut the office down and the church building down because of some potential possible COVID-19 exposure. And so as soon as we know what's going on with that, we'll let everybody know. But for now, everyone's at home and we'll be worshiping. Well, this week's worship service will only be online and we won't be broadcasting from the church either. It'll just be probably just be me here preaching the sermon to you guys. So I'll be preaching to my computer on Sunday at our usual time at 10:30. So that's what's going on this week, and appreciate your patience as we just navigate what is the absolutely insane 2020. So, but just pray for wisdom for all of us as we know, figure out what to do and what next steps are as well. So that's enough of that. And so what we're going to do today is our Wednesday in the Word has been about great chapters in the Bible. And so what we're going to do for the next 2 weeks, this week and next week, is look at Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. And we're going to split it into two, and we're going to split it into two based on what Jesus said in Matthew. In fact, let me read to you before we even get into Exodus. Let me read to you. This is from Matthew 22:34 through 40. All right. So it says, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. Second's like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and prophets. And it's been pointed out by many that the Ten Commandments are really divided up that way of love God, love people. With the first four commandments being very much about loving God and the others coming down the line about loving people. And so that's how we're going to divide it up. Now, let's get a little context here. Because we forget, when we read, like if you're reading straight through the Bible, and you get to Exodus chapter 20, you have read all of Genesis and the first 19 chapters of Exodus, and you have learned a lot about the nature and character of God. But remember that the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, was written while they were wandering in the desert. That's when the Holy Spirit inspired Moses to write those things down, to pass it on to the next generation. The historical context of when the Ten Commandments is given is that the nation of Israel has been in slavery. Well, they've been in Egypt for 430 years. They've been in slavery for quite a bit of that. And they were just now, I'm about to sneeze. Happens every week, doesn't it? Yeah. We're going to not sneeze. Okay, here we go. We shall overcome. I think we overcame. All right, so they had been in slavery for so long, they had been in a polytheistic pagan environment. This idea of there being one true God was totally new to them. In fact, Moses had to tell them God's name, Yahweh or I am. Remember, Moses asked the Lord, he said, if I'm going to go do this, I need you to tell me your name so I can tell them your name. So their knowledge of God was extremely minimal. In other words, they were just beginning to learn who God was. He used the plagues to show them who he was, to show him his power, to show his character, to show his retribution, and the fact that he sets his people separate from the rest of the world. So when they get to Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments are really just simply the ABCs of knowing who God is. They're babies in their faith. And so what the Ten Commandments do is they teach the nation of Israel and they teach us about the character of God. They're just the building blocks. They're the foundations, just like when you learn to read as a child and you started to learn your phonics and your alphabet, all those things that go into that. The Ten Commandments are the foundation, but they're very simple. and they're there to help us build up and learn about the character of God. So that's the context. These aren't given to people who are mature in their faith. These aren't given to people who have an understanding yet, a full understanding yet, that God is the only God, and that He is gracious and merciful, and there's a Redeemer coming. They're going to learn all that over time. And they knew some of it because the stories had continued within the nation, but they had been so saturated with paganism for so long, they revert back very quickly to it in the golden calf incident. It's just their default mode, because that's what they grew up with hundreds of years being down in Egypt. And so when they get the Ten Commandments, which are spoken by God Himself, they hear these things. It's not like God told Moses and then He tells the people. That would come later, because this is going to scare them to death, the fact that they hear God speak these commandments. So let me read it to you. Exodus 20, verse 1. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven, above or on the earth, beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave unpunished who takes His name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day, and therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now that's where we're going to stop today, but I'm going to keep reading the verses we're going to look at next week. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Very familiar verses, but notice the first thing that God tells us, or tells them, and it's obviously telling us. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He reminds them of all the events they've just been through. They've just been through the time of the plagues. We're not completely sure how long that took. Could have been 6 months, could have been 12 months, could have been 18. But it was, we can read it pretty quickly in those chapters. But quite a bit of time. It took quite a bit of time for all those plagues to be established. And so he's reminding them, okay, this is who I am. I'm the one that rescued you. And then he says, you shall have no other gods before me. That's the first thing he tells them. That's the first commandment. And the reason he does this is because in their mind, they understand, they believe, and are at least been taught and been surrounded for hundreds of years with the belief that there are multiple gods. And so it would have been the natural thing for them, not the godly thing. It would have been the natural thing for them to just assume that God himself was just a god among other gods who happened to be a little bit more powerful than the Egyptian gods. And maybe as time went on, they would find other gods who were more powerful than him. And so it's going to take a while for them to really realize and understand that there's only one true God. There's only one God. Remember, these are the ABCs. He's slowly starting to get them to understand who he is. And you and I know, while we understand that there's only one true God, we do understand that idols are real, and that any idolic power comes from the demonic. that there aren't other gods, but that Satan and the demons will use those false gods created by humanity and use their spiritual power of darkness to perform the miraculous and the supernatural, so that people believe they're actually worshiping false gods, when the truth is the New Testament makes this clear, they're actually worshiping the demonic. And so God tells them from the very beginning, he's number one, he's it. That you don't get a little bit of Yahweh and mix in a little bit of Moloch too, or a little bit of Baal. That's not how this works. You and I are to be completely and wholly committed to the one true God. And then, of course, the Bible then makes that more clear as it progresses, that God is Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All that is slowly revealed, but they're not ready for that yet. God will. It's called progressive revelation. You're not ready to read Shakespeare when you're still learning your ABCs. And that's the point. That's why there's such a difference here. So he says, you shall have no other gods before me. And then he addresses something that we'll see is going to be an immediate problem. He says in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven, above earth, or on the earth, beneath it, or in the water underneath the earth. So, and he says, you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. Now let me address this backwards. Because you read that verse and you're like, oh, wait a minute, does this mean that if my grandparents sinned, that God can punish me for their sins? No, that's not what he's talking about, because the scripture directly says in Deuteronomy 24:16 that children won't be punished for what the parents did, and the parents won't be punished for what the children did. What he's talking about here is that if idolatry persists in every generation is going to be punished for it equally. So if the grandparents are idolatrous, they're going to be punished. If they passed it on to the parents and the parents are idolatrous, then they're going to be punished for it. If the parents pass it on to the kids and then the kids are idolatrous, they're going to be punished for it. And so the Lord's not going to put up with this. And so that's what he's saying. He says, you better get this right. And he talks about not making an idol. Now, why would he have to say that? Well, once again, they had been in Egypt for hundreds of years, surrounded by idols, by statues. I mean, a lot of these things have been preserved, and they had multiple gods. And the first thing that's going to happen when they get nervous about Moses being on the mountain for too long is they're going to create the golden calf. And they're going to say that golden calf is the God who brought them out of Egypt. They create an idol of the true God. And that's what he's telling them you can't do, because God is spirit, and any idol is gonna pale. You can't see him. He's perfect. And you and I can't create perfection. Only God can do that. And so the idea of something that actually represents him is impossible, because he's perfect. And so he says, guys, don't do that. Don't do what you've seen for these hundreds of years. Don't create an idol from me. And so, because he describes himself as in verse 6 as showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. So he says, if you fall into idolatry, I'm going to punish every generation for it. But know that if you don't fall into idolatry, then you're not going to suffer from that. Then in verse 7, he says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Now, the simplest, probably least theological application of this is the obvious idea of not swearing, not using particular words that you and I would consider to be cuss words, swear words, that mention God. And that's true. That's certainly true. But that's sort of the ground level of this thing. To somebody's name, you and I don't really think like this anymore, but somebody's name in time of the Old and New Testament represented their character, represented their nature. And to take the Lord's name in vain is to do things and claim them that they're godly, to say things about God that simply aren't true, things that pull him down to our level. It's equivalent really to making a false image. False images of him, whether it's a golden calf or somebody trying to make a statue of what God looks like, bring him down to our level. To take his name in vain is to do that same thing and to say things about God that aren't true, say things that we think about him that are often based on who we are, not on who he is. And so we're not to do that. We're not to take his name in vain. We are to lift him up. We are to honor him. And if we claim his name, Christians, our lives are not to be lived in vanity. They are to honor his name. They are to reflect his name. So he's telling them in one command, don't make a statue, don't make an idol that is false about me. And then in this one he's saying, don't live a life that's false about me. Don't take my name in vain. Don't live that way. So that's that commandment. And then the last one we'll look at is the Sabbath day commandment. Now the word Sabbath literally means to stop. So the Sabbath day is the stopping day. It's the day we stop. It's the day the work stops. So he says in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day, the stopping day, to keep it holy. And then he gives the explanation. He says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. So a 6-day work week with 1 day for rest and worship. But the seventh day is a Sabbath, or a stopping of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. So that's everybody. Not only you who are in charge of the household, but the kids and the cows and the guests. Everybody. Everybody takes Saturday at the time, Sunday for us, because that's the day Christ was raised. But that Saturday was to be a day where you did the absolute minimum and you focused on the Lord. And he says, why? In verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now remember, a few weeks ago when we looked at Genesis 1 through 3 and we talked about that seventh day, the New Testament says that the Sabbath is a picture of salvation. We have the completed salvation is our Sabbath rest. And so you have a picture even in the Ten Commandments of salvation by having that command to take a day of rest, to reflect and mirror that seventh day that God took to rest from his creation, that the New Testament says that's a picture of salvation. There is a Sabbath rest for God's people that you and I haven't experienced yet, but we will in our glorification in the new heaven and the new earth, the new Jerusalem, forever. The I will be saved that we're still waiting to experience. And so here in these first few verses, these first 11 verses, these first commandments, it's all about God's character and nature. He tells us he's to be the only one. We're to relate to him and that he is absolutely in charge of our life. And we're not to bring him down to our level. We're not to make an idol that looks like him. So we're not we're not to make something, and we're to live also in a way that doesn't bring him down to our level. We're not to take his name in vain in what we do. And then we're to make sure that we set aside that time to focus on worshiping him. So the Ten Commandments are fascinating in that it starts out, as everything should, as focused on our relationship with him. They are God-centered, and then we'll get into the man-centered ones as well. And so, guys, that's the first part of the Ten Commandments. And so we'll finish those up next week and see what we see in those very familiar passages that he talks about, that God, remember, he's speaking these to the people. They're hearing it, and it's going to scare them to death. So, I need to mention something. I just now looked at myself in the screen here. I didn't realize I was doing this, but somebody asked me, when I did this from home during that time we were quarantined for so long. I wore this shirt a few times doing this video, and a church member said, I could only see the half circle. They could see every now and then I wear a Star Wars shirt and you could read it. And they said, what's the half circle? The half circle, this is Captain America. See? So for the person that asked, it's a Captain America shirt. I told you if it ever popped up, I'd let you know. And so there you go. Team Captain America represented on Wednesday in the Word on Thursday. We're just all over the place in that. Well, guys, hope the rest of the week and weekend go well. Do remember that we won't be in the church building on Sunday. Instead, just get on Facebook Live at 10:30, and we'll worship together there. And we'll keep everybody updated as far as when we get word about what we need to do as far as results from COVID-19 tests and that sort of thing. Well, guys, stay cool out there. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Wash your hands. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. It's important. Very grateful that we had our masks on, and that we're on these past few Sundays as we see the cases rise and rise and rise in our area. I know it's frustrating, and I know they're hot, and I know nobody really likes to do it, but it's an important thing for us to do, to wear those masks to keep one another safe. So stay safe out there, and we'll see everybody online on Sunday morning.